Good morning, everyone. Hello and welcome. My name is Maren Sakri. I run demand generation for Evolv Technologies. Today, we're kicking off part 3 of our Think CX Digital Leaders Tell All. Today, we focus on creating a culture of experimentation. Recently, there was an article written by Harvard Business Review. Recently, that article talked about how leading companies have embraced a culture of experimentation. And they state that to successfully innovate, companies need to make experimentation an integral part of everyday life, even when budgets are tight. That means creating an environment where employees' curiosity is nurtured and data trumps opinion. I've heard a lot of product managers who see a lot of value in using data and experimentation to improve their products, but who also struggle to build that company-wide culture of experimentation. So I'm eager to jump into this conversation today with 2 experimentation experts. Before I introduce our panelists, quick little note, if you have any questions, please feel free to put those into the question queue below. We'll get to those at the last 5 to 10 minutes of the call. And if we don't have time to get to the questions, feel free to still put those in and we will be sure to follow up via email. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our panel of digital leaders. Greg Shaffer is the Executive Director of Product and Data Science at Edmonds. He has been a digital product and technology leader for over 15 years and leads the integration and machine learning techniques into growth processes. He joined Edmunds in 2011 and is responsible for developing and executing a long-term digital growth and experimentation strategy. Greg leads teams of product managers, designers, developers, analysts, and data scientists to increase product yield with an experimentation culture. Sam Nazari is the Vice President of Customer Success at Evolv. He leads the global customer success and solutions engineering teams. Sam works closely with Evolv's customers to ensure they have the training, support, and experimentation roadmap to ensure their success. So thank you so much for both of you to join us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Maren.
So I'm going to kick this off with a broad question here to get us started. I'm going to start with Greg. Can you tell us a little bit about experimentation at Edmonds? Realized you have a pretty mature experimentation culture already, but if you could talk a little bit about how that's grown and also why Edmonds considers experimentation such an important part of the product development process.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for having me here today. Yeah, Edmonds is a foundation of experimentation that started even before I started at Edmonds, but it started really in our product organization, building just the fundamental skills of knowing when to experiment and when not to. And so really how it's evolved and matured over time since I've been there has been the expansion of the number of changes that the product team chooses to test before just launching directly to the site or to anyone else. So that's really the first way we've expanded is we test a higher percentage of changes to the site. Another way we've matured and grown is the type of tools that we use for experimentation and techniques. We've expanded beyond A/B testing into multivariate testing and into propensity model testing as well, to really find the right tool for the experiment at hand that you're trying to run. If you need speed, if you need a large set of changes to test, or if you need to find if there's a change that works well for only a small segment of your population, what's the right tool, and knowing which tool to use and which process to use at what time, that learning process has really grown. And another place, the third place we've expanded is we've really broadened our reach beyond just the product team as well. Almost every department at Edmonds now, if it's the sales team, the strategy team, the technology team, the operations team, everyone has this experimentation mindset of before we make a major change, let's test to make sure that it's actually going to be better for our customers and for our business. And that really kind of speaks to your second question, which is why is experimentation so important at Edmonds? To me, it's the alternative is worse. If you are not testing the changes that you're making, you don't know if you're making a better site, a better experience for your customers, and a better and more growth for your business or not. On our side, we see probably about 1 out of 5 A/B tests that show a significant lift. And so, kind of flipping that back, if we were to not have tested or experimented with those 5 changes, 4 things would have gone out to our customers that would have been bad for their experience or bad for the company, and we wouldn't have known that. We all have a finite set of resources in terms of a customer flow or an audience. And I just really don't want to provide 4 out of 5 bad ideas to our customers and not even know it. I want to use that traffic and that audience the most efficient way possible by only promoting the changes that we know are better for the customer and the business to the site.
Can you speak to an example of what you do for a new innovation or a highly speculative project?
Yeah, it's a good question because we have to. There's no one size fits all solution to how kind of we operate. These speculative projects are kind of on the R&D side. Besides their typical KPIs and OKRs that we set for any team, and they're going to be different for a growth or a speculative team. One of the things we push them to do is have a measurement of how many tests are you running, at what cadence are you running tests. If that's 2 tests a week, 3 tests a month, 4 tests every 2 weeks, it depends on the situation, but it really gets teams to think about what is the next thing I can test to learn. So a KPI of how many tests did you run last week is a way that we push those. Now, that's not a tactic we use long term. Once a project or team kind of hits their stride, we kind of back off on that. We take the learnings that we learned in those first rapid fire tests, and then we think more critically about what is the next test or next experiment that we can set up. Because it's not sustainable, and it's probably not best practice to run that long term, but it is a way to kind of jumpstart new teams into getting a lot of research, a lot of learnings into the team fast.
Great, thanks. And I'm going to turn this over to Sam for a moment. So Sam, you have a ton of experience working with a lot of different types of companies. Can you talk a little bit about why inculcating a company-wide culture of experimentation is so important, and what benefits have you seen companies gain?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I've had the privilege of working with many organizations, small and large, with various levels of experimentation maturity. And really, an organization can bring in pretty powerful tools to enable them to do experimentation, but in order to really drive innovation, scale growth, it really comes down to the culture. Investing in the right resources so that you can come up with the best ideas for the problems that you're trying to solve. Ensuring that the KPIs that of the experimentation program align with the top line business goals. That's super important because you want to get executive buy-in so that you can get that company-wide support. You can get more resources allocated to the program so that you can continue to scale the program, run more experiments on different parts of the funnel that continue to reflect what the top line business goals are. So really it's about getting the most out of the program, is to build that culture, foster the culture, and really mature the culture over time. And types of benefits I've seen companies gain, I mean, from companies that have kind of an entry level maturity of experimentation, I've seen them start off with a small team, running sequential large scale tests, getting good results, being able to communicate those results effectively and show the impact that it has on those top line KPIs to executive leadership. And then, starting to build out the team, starting to get more, for example, user experience researchers allocated to the program. So now they have more folks looking at how to solve user experience problems, more analysts, And then that way you're simultaneously running more experiments and having more shots on target to find the most optimal customer experience, which is in the end to help you drive innovation and scale growth.
I'm going to ask you another question here, something I know you're super passionate about. What do you think some of the main challenges are that companies face when trying to build a culture of experimentation?
Yeah, I see this. Don't hold back. Okay, I have a few here. One that I see that's super common is misalignment of incentives. And I'll give you an example. I think this really hinders the potential for massive growth, especially with the accounts that I've worked with. And an example is I worked with a large organizations where different business unit leaders own different pages within a funnel. And when we work with them to kind of generate the program manager to generate a list of use cases to focus on, where we could really find a lot of low-hanging fruit. I mean, there was one instance where we looked at the data. We looked at the different pages that made sense based on the data analysis that we did. And we found an area in the funnel, lower part of the funnel, that had a lot of low-hanging fruit and an incredible opportunity for us to optimize. Initially, we were blocked because someone else owned that particular page, and it made sense. They had their own testing roadmap, and that individual is evaluated on how many tests they can execute year over year. So they're not going to stop their testing program, and that's a great example of misalignment of incentives. And so we got leadership support. We were able to push this test through, run a large scale test that ended up being the result was, when they did their own analysis, was this is tens of millions of dollars increase in annual revenue because we were optimizing for their macro conversion event, which was purchases. And I think about how many times we go through that and we see that pattern over and over, and think of how many misses we have and how many uphill battles we have to fight in order to be able to focus on those areas where there is a lot of opportunity for optimization. So I typically go in and try to help some of these leaders in the organization make those folks participants in the program, which I'll get into in a little bit later. But yeah, that's number one for me, is misalignment of incentives. Making the participants in your culture active. So when you're bringing in a new tool, make sure that you're taking the time to train them, onboard them, introduce the new process and where they fit within the process. And one thing that I see almost every single time is when we get in, and due to the nature of the product, is we can test a lot of ideas. And the user experience team comes up with a solid design system, brand guidelines, et cetera. And sometimes the folks that actually own what goes on the page and gets adopted doesn't always line up with the vision of user experience. So some of the ways that we've helped organizations with this is getting the user experience team involved early in the process. Use that expertise in the ideation process. The better the ideas are, the better the potential results will be. And then get them involved as well in the adoption process. A lot of times we have the luxury of finding multiple winning experiences, and they can get involved in that adoption process based on the system that they've created. So we've worked on that quite a bit with various organizations over time. And then the third one is being able to overcome the lack of executive buy-in and really get support for that culture of experimentation. And in order to get executive buy-in, you have to speak their language. And in my experiences, it's been, if you can speak in terms of how much money you made the company, you're going to get a lot of buy-in versus trying to convince them that losing is the new winning. I hate when I hear that losing is the new winning. I mean, I get the theory. It makes sense. We're learning. But if you can show executives that this is a revenue generating center and not a cost center, you will get their buy-in. You will get resources allocated to the program. And there are ways of being able to scale that, which we've been involved in with quite a few organizations.
I really liked your point about getting teams involved early, because I do think sometimes people just naturally want to protect what they're bringing to the organization. So I want to get Greg's opinion on this a little bit, just given the maturity of the culture that is built already at Edmonds. What type of collaborative efforts have you put in place to ensure the culture at Edmonds continues to evolve? In one of our earlier conversations, you mentioned the 3 pillars of success. Can you talk a little bit further about that?
Sure. Yeah, when Sam hit the nail on the head, is you have different teams that have different goals or different kind of micro parts of a funnel that can sometimes I know follow their own, but they're focusing on what they're incentivized to grow. And so really one of the first things that we try to do is make sure everyone, no matter what part of the funnel you're working on, understands what KPI, what metric matters to the customer and matters to the business, matters to revenue. And you start with that equation. And the equation could be as simple as you have X number of customers coming in the top, you have a certain conversion rate of those customers, and you have a certain amount of revenue per conversion that exists. And it can be as simple as that. And there's a lot of other metrics that a lot of businesses use, but trying to correlate them to one of those top level metrics is key. And typically, I think what Sam was talking about, sometimes what happens is that middle conversion metric is split between multiple teams. And so getting everyone to understand you're trying to grow your piece of the funnel, your conversion step of the funnel, but really what matters is the overall conversion rate of the product or the site or whatever project you're working on. How is that impacting? Because you don't want to increase the top funnel but cannibalize your conversion downstream, and it doesn't help anyone. And so really from a management and leadership standpoint is making sure that teams are incentivized with the top level KPI that everyone rallies behind, even though they're only affecting a micro KPI. The second pillar that I like to base teams around is to meet regularly. If typically we'll have 2 1-hour meetings a week, that it's a brainstorm / strategy meeting, that we have all the teams that are rolling up to that single KPI that are in different parts of the funnel, even on the audience acquisition side of things as well. And really in those meetings, we're meeting with product teams, user experience researchers, designers, analysts, data scientists, and developers sometimes if we need to see what feasibility it looks like on some of these things. But in those sessions, every team is bringing to those brainstorming strategy sessions the results of the tests that they are currently running or they just recently ran, with some comprehensive notes on it, not too detailed, but enough for us to understand what they learned from that test. And it's really for the rest of the teams to hear what worked and what didn't work, so we don't repeat failures that sometimes occur. And it's a very open and honest and transparent dialogue. It's really to see where you're at and what worked for you. And so with those results, we comment on those as a group. We decide together what to promote to the site, what not to promote, and why. And it really has that strategic direction guidance behind it. It says that this is the direction we want to go, and it's better for the user, and it's better for the top level KPI. So let's promote that. And again, it's very honest, but it does give a sanity check across teams to make sure that we're staying true to the top level KPI. And in that meeting, we're also in real time coming up with next test ideas, new changes, and because the point of that meeting is to bring the learning that all these teams throughout the company have just learned from their own tests together, and really that inspires new ideas real time. And then we discuss what is the best way to test that, what is the best tool to test that, and what's the priority of that test, because there's a lot of things that every team is working on, and sometimes you when you get new learnings, you want to jump on those fast, and you need to reprioritize your backlog. So that's kind of the second point, is to meet regularly. And the third point or pillar that I like to focus on is always asking the question of what's the impact. And this kind of goes back to my point before of why experiment. And my answer is because the alternative is worse, is because if you don't know what the impact is of the thing you just did, why did you do it? You have a hypothesis of what you thought was going to happen. And so once you ran your test, if the test was set up correctly, if it was designed properly, you should be able to answer your hypothesis and answer that question of what's the impact. And if you ask that question over and over and over again, people are reminded that to be testing their experiments before just making changes.
So the three pillars: first one, get different teams on the same metric,
Yep.
Meet regularly, and ask what the impact is. And I do agree with you. That last one is sometimes challenging because you just get moved on to the next thing.
Right.
So having that ability to really force everyone to say, stop, let's really discuss those results.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then taking that metric conversation a little step further, what metrics is your team specifically focused on?
Yeah, as often as possible, we try to get back to what I mentioned before, is consumer experience and revenue. And really, the closer you can tie your top level, your macro KPI to revenue, the better success we've found. So using that example, the very overly simplistic example of audience coming into your product, conversion rate of your product, and then revenue per conversion, that is close to that a metric in that funnel as possible is going to be is what we found to be the best. Now, especially whenever you're working on these highly speculative projects, that's not always possible because you don't know how a new kind of bigger moonshot idea is going to tie to revenue. So those are going to be harder, and you may need to find proxy measures that you think would tie to revenue given time and maturity of the product. So those are hard, but as often as you can, get to a revenue metric. If you're running 2 or 3 tests a week, you're going to have to use a more real-time metric like a conversion rate of a session, or things that you can measure on a day-by-day basis. Longer and slower tests, you can use measurements or metrics like monthly active users or return visitation, those type of things. But I'd still strongly recommend tying anything back to the revenue equation as closely as you can, staying away from those vanity metrics.
So to echo Sam, be a revenue generating team.
That's right. And that's a good point. Like, your team is there to generate revenue or to grow the business in some way. Experimentation is just a tool to achieve that goal. And really focusing on, this is another tool in your toolbox that you want to. And what we found is that using this tool is better than not using this tool to achieve your goals of your team.
So you mentioned collaboration. Can you elaborate on building synergy between disparate teams? How do you encourage different teams to share information with one another, both on wins and losses in experiments?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of sounds like a broken record at this point, but using that common KPI, and everyone is incentivized to that common KPI, that macro goal. And when one team does something to grow that KPI, everyone wins. And I think that's one of the best ways to incentivize people to collaborate and work together. Now, you can take pride in your team came up with the idea and tested the idea that grew that top level KPI, and there should be some pride and a little bit of competition between teams is good, but the competition shouldn't result in cannibalization of the top level goal. It should be something that helps the greater good, even if it was your team that kind of came up with that.
So when we went through the registration process, we had a question out there. If anyone had a question out front, feel free to ask it. And a few registrants submitted a question about how to run a large number of experiments simultaneously and keep track of them. And then that went into how do you prioritize and prevent different experiments on the same pages and elements from interfering with one another. So I'll start with Greg, and then Sam, would love for you to tackle onto this one as well.
Yeah, this is a great question. If you're experimenting a lot, you're going to have a lot of tests to keep track of. We found success. Again, we have these very frequent brainstorm strategy meetings, and we sometimes use a running diary type a document just for people to be able to refer back to that kind of like a keyword type lookup of we talked about that one thing on that one time. Let me go back and look in that document. But that's just kind of like almost like a table of contents, because that's how people think. They think, and I was sitting in that conference room. Well, back when we were sitting in conference rooms, I was sitting in that conference room, and that one thing came up. What I can kind of get back to that moment in my memory. But that's really just like a launch point into having a good framework or dashboard system set up of results of tests that you've run. Now, at Edmonds, we have a homegrown, internally built testing framework that we run most of our experiments through, A/B test experiments through. And so it's deeply integrated into our front-end code and our data warehouse. And so we have historical, very clean metrics and data to be able to refer back to. So we can always pull those numbers back. And we look at dashboards on a daily basis. It says, what are all the tests that are running right now, and how are they performing on the top KPIs that tests should be performing on? And that gets emailed out to a number of leaders and stakeholders throughout the company, so everyone understands what's going on right now. And oh, this one looks interesting. It's showing a positive lift here. On the prioritization question, again, it's a great one. It's we do sometimes it's formal, sometimes it's just kind of informal in your head of a 2x2 matrix of you're doing two variables, you're comparing of feasibility or how fast will it take to both set up but also learn to set up the test and then run the experiment, compared to the general belief of what the impact could be. And so you're kind of plotting experiment ideas on those two axes, and then you're trying to find the fastest tests that you think will have the biggest impact. And you kind of work in that quadrant of that 2x2 matrix and then work down from there. So we very much bump previous ideas on the backlog down because something came up that we think was better and faster. And we often are pushing things back as needed.
Great, I like that. So 2x2 matrix, length of time versus impact, essentially.
That's right.
Cool. Sam.
I think it's a great question. There's a few things here that I'll break down. In terms of running a large number of experiments simultaneously and being able to keep track of them, it's super important in terms of when you're setting up the experiments, especially, in our product, we have a way to be able to, at a project level, define and describe what you're testing and what the goal of the project is. So it's important to document that, as well as the individual variants that you do set up. It's important to provide what we call nicknames, so that you have a way of identifying what types of changes were part of that experiment. So if someone else from a different team goes back and sees, what did I test? And the site's already been updated, et cetera, they have a reference point of the types of changes that were tested. Prioritization, it really depends on the company. A lot of companies use different prioritization models like PI or ICE, looking at potential impact, ease of implementation. So we talk about that with organizations and based on how they want to adopt a prioritization model. And then different experiments on the same pages and elements. So a couple things there. One is because you can run, large scale experiments through Evolv. Evolv handles the traffic allocation, and a user is part of a specific test group at a given time. So you can identify multiple different elements and variants within a specific project. And then different ways to handle running multiple simultaneous projects, making them mutually exclusive so they don't interfere with each other, and then scoping them appropriately based upon the goal and the types of ideas that you come up with. So is it multi-page funnel type experiments or projects that you're running, or are you going to run a lower funnel experiment that starts on a specific page in the lower funnel, maybe optimizing for the end goal, the macro conversion event, and then a different experiment top of the funnel optimizing for progression. So we have best practices there that we help organizations with.
So moving on into the actual experiments, what makes for a well thought out and well run experiment? Greg, I'll tee that up with you first.
We find some of the best experiments are those, if you're looking at a funnel, again, experimentation often crosses over to non-product teams such as sales and strategy and operations. But speaking about product type experiments, it's the one that we find the most success working kind of backwards from the funnel. We don't have to always do that. If you have multiple teams, you can have different teams working in parallel on different parts of the funnel. But we found some of the most successful experiments run at lower in the funnel and then working up from there. I think generally going back to as often as you can, coming back to that the old tried and true scientific process of you start with a hypothesis that you think is true, as that's step one, and then you think about what is a way that you can test that given the scenario you have, the tools and data that you have access to. What is a way that you can set up a test to prove or disprove that hypothesis? And before you run the test, I think this is also really critical, is determine what success is of that test before you start. It's very easy to not do that, run a test and say, I got a 5% lift. That's good enough. Let's promote that. But if you were to ask yourself that before setting out on that, and you're saying, this is not worth doing unless it's a 10% lift. And I'm just hypothetically creating scenarios here. Your emotions you can remove your emotions from the decision at the end by setting those goals up front. And we find that works well to make better business decisions. If you're trying to set what a success goal looks like based on business metrics, not based on emotions of I'm really tied to this test or I really like this test, so I'll make it work. And so I think that's really important too. And that stretches across between product and sales and strategy and all different departments of the organization as well. Another thing to think about is there's different types of tests you can run. I think of it, there's a spectrum of tests. You could run big swing idea tests that are kind of more on the moonshot side of things. Maybe you have less frequency of getting a hit on that, but your impact is potentially much bigger. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have more optimization, more likely to get a hit or a win, but maybe the wins are smaller. And so finding the right balance of your project, of your team, of your company, of how you invest in that balance. Is it 60-40? Is it 70-30? Is it 30-70? And there's no right answer. It's just knowing that I don't think it's good to always put everything into one camp or the other. Having both things, both processes going at the same time, even if it's multiple teams doing, one's assigned to big swing and the other multiple teams are tied to optimization, or is within a team of just, I want one of your 5 ideas to be a big swing, take a chance, whatever your ratio is. It can be done in different ways, but I think that's also important, is to take bigger risks, but have a system that allows you to know when it works and when it doesn't fast.
Sam, you've seen some epic wins and some really bad falls. What's your take on this question?
Honestly, I think Greg nailed it from every angle. I think, best practice for me is, obviously I look at, data to help me find where the friction points are, but really working backwards from that macro conversion event has been always a best practice that has worked well for me. I think also Greg already mentioned this, but I see this over and over. What is the goal of the experiment? Like, what is your optimization metric? And then also, is this experiment reflecting the overall KPIs of the experimentation program? And I think starting with your optimization metric, understanding what that is, looking at the data to find the friction points, and then doing a heuristics analysis, and then trying to come up with solutions for the problems that you're finding. I think you have to go through that process to come up with the best ideas. And I think, in terms of a well-run experiment, you've found winners. Awesome. That's great. Harvest the gains of those winners through the platform or by making that your new control. But also, what are the insights that we're able to take away to help us fuel the next round of ideas, where we're continuously optimizing and we're looking at what worked well and what didn't work well, and coming up with new hypotheses based on the insights that we got from that particular experiment. I don't think you're done once it ends. You have to use the additional data that you got from that experiment to build on top of it for the next rounds of experiments.
So let's talk vanity metrics. Should people stop paying attention to vanity metrics when evaluating their experimentation efforts? Sam, you had a big grin, so I'll go with you first on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I see a lot of experiments just working with clients, and sometimes I have to ask, like, why are you running this experiment? Like, what's the goal of this? Oh, well, it's to increase social media shares. Okay, and how do you think that's going to help the overall KPIs that you're optimizing for? So it's always asking that question of, like, how is this experiment going to help drive growth? Is it to get insights? And if it's not doing either of those, I don't recommend that you invest the time, effort, resources, because it does take resources to come up with ideas and build the experiments, and the time to run it and manage it and look at the data and then take actions on that data. So keep that energy focused towards goals and KPIs that actually matter.
Yeah, I'd second that. I mean, you can ask the question, if you were to, let's say you're looking for a 10% lift on a vanity metric, throw out what if you actually tripled that vanity metric? What would that actually do to the business? What would that actually do to the company? And if you put them in that mama bear, papa bear, like, what if you take that to the extreme and you still don't actually lift the metric that matters, then that's a kind of a good litmus test of then it's probably not a good test running. If it's not the metric you're looking for, is probably not the best one. I will say on the I like to look at things like a proxy metric, especially in those early highly speculative days. You don't have a revenue-based metric yet, but I would be careful to pick a proxy metric to a revenue metric rather than choosing a vanity metric just for sake of picking a metric to optimize toward, and finding a metric that is close to as revenue as possible. I think that's really important.
Thank you. So moving on to another area, what sorts of resources or support should you ask your vendor for to ensure your experimentation program is successful? So I'll start with Sam, since that's his day-to-day.
Yeah, sure. I think it starts with making sure that you ask your vendor, you make it clear about who the folks are on your team that's going to be using the tool, and ensuring what kind of training programs they have to make those particular individuals successful using the tool. I think it's also asking your vendor that, if you have a very strict process around your current experimentation program, how do I start with fitting this tool within my current process, and then over time come up with a plan to start to scale and really tweak the process around getting the most out of your tool, as well as, if you're running a lot of experiments and let's say you're not producing the results that you want, does the vendor have either professional expert services or a list of partners that you can get in touch with to bring in and help you with the ideation portion, analysis, even, you want to scale the implementation efforts and run more experiments, but you don't have the dev resources. Reach out to your vendor and ask who from your side or your partners can we work with to help us scale from this perspective. So I would focus on all of those.
Greg, what are your thoughts here? In your experiences?
I think Sam nailed it. It's what can you do internally versus what don't you have the resources for, and there's a lot of different options of areas to help, if it's just developer resources, if it's idea generation. There's a lot of different things out there. It's kind of like when your needs outpace what you have currently is a good time to go look outside with generally anything.
One final question here before we dive into Q&A. Greg, besides experimentation, what other important skills does a product team need to build in order to move the needle on the customer experience?
Going to the ultimate question of what a product team's job is to understand the customer's needs. That's key. It's first and foremost to being a successful product team. If you don't know what the customer wants or what job they're here to do with your product, you have no chance of building something that they want and that they will use and that meets their needs, and therefore will generate growth for your company. So it's going back to those foundations of understanding a customer's needs. Whenever another key skill that I see is knowing how to design tests. And part of this is knowing, should this be a multivariate test? Should this be an A/B test? But more so on what is the thing you need to learn the most about? And I guess I'm speaking more on the research-oriented tests and not on a conversion or a growth type test. If you are more on that speculative side of things on a project, there are so many unknowns to launch a new project or a new product that it can be overwhelming. And so having a good process to knowing how to filter out the things that don't matter as much or are harder to test, and start focusing on the things that are most important. A framework we use is going back to that kind of 2x2 tool that's very powerful, is if you have a lot of things that must be true for something to be successful, there are a lot of assumptions that must be in that category. And if you can kind of graph those on a chart of what is the most known thing versus unknown, how much do we think we know about this assumption already, with internal knowledge, and then also how critical is it for the success of the product, or dependent on the product success. And so if you look at things that you really don't have an answer on, you have no idea, you know that it's very important, or it must be true, but you have no idea if it's true or not, and you have no idea, but it's also very, very important that it be true for success. Go find those ideas first, and then go to the testing step to figure out what is the right way to test that, to set up an experiment, sitting with your hypothesis, data collection, setting a goal ahead of time, and then going down that route. So I think those are two key skills that every product team needs to have.
Great, thanks. So we've got a handful of questions, Q&A that came in through email and live. So I'm going to ask those. I'm going to do this a little bit backwards based on what I think you all will be excited to answer. So the first question, how do you convince leaders that experimentation is not a team of people doing A/B tests, but a set of principles on how to operate? Sam?
Yeah, going back to what I mentioned earlier is find quick wins and demonstrate how you're driving growth. And then you will get their attention, and then they will say, okay, well, how are you able to do this? Well, we were able to drive growth by finding the most optimal customer experiences for the most important segments for our business, and we're going to do this continuously. And you will, as long as you demonstrate results, you will get their attention, and you will they will listen to exactly how you're able to accomplish that through your experimentation program. I hear over and over that, as long as we can convince our leaders that losing is the new winning, and, we're learning every time, learning is great. Learning is awesome. I think you should learn as much as you can, but that at the end of the day, you have to deliver results and focus on finding the biggest results that you can as soon as you can. So look for the lowest hanging fruit, spend the time to look at the data, allocate resources from the user experience side to come up with great ideas and take it seriously, and start with that macro conversion event, and that's most impactful to your business. And as Greg said, work backwards in the funnel. That's always worked well for with the teams that I've worked with.
Thanks. And I'm going to continue this journey down revenue. So Greg, how do you measure, quantify how experiments actually impact the bottom line?
I think we touched on this a lot. Is if your test is the conversion metric or the conversion event or the KPI that you're measuring is closely tied to revenue, it's easy. It's easy to answer the question of how much impact did the test have on revenue. The not so easy part is sometimes coming up with a metric that you can actually measure in near real time that ties to revenue based on different business models and revenue models. I find that that's the harder task to accomplish. And that's where sometimes proxy metrics to revenue are needed, as long as they're very tightly coupled. But as long as you're doing that, then you should have a pretty good idea of when this experiment produced X lift on your metric, then that we should see Y lift on revenue. So it's again, getting back to that revenue metric is tightly as you can.
Right. And last question today. Sam, what kinds of experiments have you seen companies run that have significantly impacted their bottom line? I'll start with Sam, and then Greg, I'd also like to hear from your experience as well.
Yeah, I think I mentioned this before, but finding that ultimate, the action that you want the user to take on your site, that macro conversion event. Oftentimes in e-commerce, it's purchases, and finding the most important segment to focus on, and make sure you're doing your segmentation properly, and again, doing the research and the data analysis to come up with the scope of the experiment, the types of problems that you're trying to solve for, and coming up with good ideas to solve for them. Just general high level patterns that I see following that process is, when you're starting with purchases, take a look at your cart pages, working backwards from there, your checkout flow, product detail pages, and then just continue to work backwards. Focus on those key areas first, and then run maybe multi-page funnel tests across the mid to lower funnel, and then work back up to upper funnel.
Yeah, I think, Sam, you nailed it. Another thing that we find is, before you launch a test, ask yourself, if this is successful, what does that mean? And if you don't have a very clear answer on if it's successful, what does that mean for the business, then you either have not set up the test correctly, you have not architected the experiments properly, or your conversion event is not tied close enough to revenue or consumer, the top level macro KPI that you're looking at, or your the changes that you're putting in there are not significant enough. So I think that's a good last minute check before diving into an experiment, is to ask yourself, if this wins, what does that mean for this team's goals, the incentivized goals that we have for ourselves, and just kind of doing that last minute check. And I think that's helpful for teams to do.
All right. So before I conclude, any final thoughts? Well, thank you both so much for joining us, Greg, Sam. A few takeaways I had: find that common shared KPI that helps create and maintain you as a revenue generating team. The 3 pillars, which I'd love to follow up on a blog content piece. And I do think the 2x2 matrix is great. So length of time by impact. So thank you for all of those. Recording will be made available. Check out evolv.ai/events. We'll have a few more coming up in May and June. And take care, everyone.
Thanks, Greg. It was a pleasure. Thanks, Maren.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a great day.